I'm Stephanie Gerber Wilson, and you're listening to Freedom Over Fascism Live. Today I'm here with Vaughn Joy, who is going to talk to us about her new book, Selling Out Santa: Hollywood Christmas Films in the Age of McCarthy. She and her husband, Ben Railton, who's a friend of Freedom Over Fascism, have a website that holds both of their scholarly work, which I think is really cool. If you are listening to this on a podcast app, please consider subscribing at freedomoverfascism.us. All of the content is free. I don't believe in gatekeeping information, but as a solo podcaster or Substacker, I need support in order to keep this series and the work I do going. You can find my live streams at 1 o'clock most Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and I have some really interesting folks coming up in January. Freedom Over Fascism is a member of 2 podcast networks, Banner and Backbone, and the Democracy Group. Okay, now that all that is done, we can take a break from thinking about the crumbling world around us and think about Christmas films and the post-World War II period in American life. Vaughn, in your book, you mentioned that Christmas isn't just a day, it's a frame of mind. Can you talk about how you use movies as a cultural piece of text to understand the reality and values of the makers and sometimes people who are pushing them? It's really close to my own work. I did a history of a museum, but used the content as text and looked at it in some similar ways. So yeah, talk to us about Christmas and movies and post-World War. I do this every time. I ask too many questions at once.
It's a good way to start, though, of just what do you feel is the most
Yeah, what do you tell us about what you do, about your new book, so people can get it, so you can definitely talk about it, and what did you do and what did you find?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. We had tried to schedule this one for about 8 months.
Yeah.
I'm really excited that we're doing this one. Yes. So my new book, Selling Out Santa, is the product of my PhD that I finished a year ago. Long and grueling, but also fun and wonderful because I studied Christmas films. And one of my favorite things in this world to do is watch a movie and think about it. I think there's so much joy in the kind of analytical discovery phase of thinking about film. So yeah, so in my book and in my column, Review Roulette, I use films as kind of social mirrors um, that we can read out of film, the political, social, economic, kind of cultural context in which they were made as a kind of multi-dimensional product. So we can think about a film as an accumulation of cultural ideas and phenomena up to that point. We can think about it as a contemporary piece from its present. And then we can think about it with us viewing it at a later date after its publication. And all of those angles open up just myriad possibilities of ways to analyze cultural texts. In the book, I use Christmas films as a kind of case study for the federal influences in Hollywood during the McCarthy era. The HUAC, House Committee on Un-American Activities, investigations in Hollywood and the hearings that they had to kind of root out communists, as they said was their goal. Whether that's true or not, it's in the book. But all of the kind of pressures in this late post-war, early Cold War period had a huge effect on Hollywood. When the executives reacted by enacting the blacklist, we had kind of cultural fallout from that. So I look at 1946 to 1951 through Christmas films to see how that happened. What actually happened to our culture in that period?
I super interested in this in a wider sense too, thinking about, Westerns and what did that mean for the way we view masculinity and all that. Ronald Reagan using his movies to share his ideals. What made you pick Christmas movies as the genre that you wanted to evaluate? Because I bet you had a lot of things that you could choose from.
I did, and I love Christmas films. I just really love them, especially from this period. There are films like It's a Wonderful Life and Miracle on 34th Street and White Christmas, Babes in Toyland, The Bishop's Wife. Like they're like classic Christmas films, all in this 15-year period. And I gravitated towards it. I did think about a few other ones. I'm not a horror person at all, so I was not interested in that. There are so many studies on sci-fis, especially in the 50s, so I felt I wouldn't have anything really interesting to say in
Mhm.
that regard. I'm not really a fan of westerns, not a John Wayne girl, but Christmas films just really grabbed me. And then as I was studying them and studying the history of American Christmas, I realized that it's absolutely fascinating. And one of the kind of most diverse and ubiquitous lenses that we have for American history and American culture, the diversity, the secular diversity of American holidays. Like it's just fascinating.
So, one of the things that always struck me as actually was an off chord for me as a Jewish girl was how much Christmas and being American was fused together. And I wonder if you would talk about the beginning of this fusion and what were the basic ideas that the makers of the films and the feds wanted to see.
So the first thing I'll say is something that can be a little controversial, but the American Christmas is first and foremost and historically secular. It is an amalgamation of lots of different immigrant winter cultures, pagan, secular, other religious. And at a later point in American history that Christians claim it as theirs. And I think that's really important. It's really important to make a distinction that the way the American Christmas developed in the early 1800s is as a communal, collective, national identity throughout the 1800s. Obviously, national meant different things at different points. But I think that's very important to note is that it was not tied to one religion or one group ever in our history and in the longer history of Christmas. There are
So,
lots of discussions to have in like ancient times as well.
right. So you are saying that, so I don't quite understand how Christmas can be secular.
Well,
But this isn't actually the conversation I want to have. So let's leave that as I don't understand how Christmas can be secular when Christ is at the middle of it, and then move on. Because the conversation I do want to have is about these films and how did they go about, what was their goal and how did they go about doing it?
so the goal follows on from that, that Christmas was a civic holiday, that Christmas embodied American ideals. And that's part of why Capra chooses A Christmas Carol, which is not a religious text about Christmas. It is not. Um, he chooses that as a basis for an American story in the post-war period. And Christmas has historically been imbued with all of these secular American patriotic ideals and is divorced from Christianity in our history. None of these films from this period, except for one, has a Christian element or even a religious element. That's The Bishop's Wife. And I think that's a really interesting thing in this Cold War period because one would think that in the Cold War, when we are trying to portray America as a God-fearing state in opposition to godless communists, you would think that Christmas films might focus on a more religious tone, but these do not. And that's part of that point of they were pro-American in an inclusive, socially conservative way, which obviously is not inclusive of the nation, but not in a religious sense at all.
So walk us through kind of the development of these films, maybe pick something like Miracle on 34th Street and how did the actual movie come to be, and were there any outside influences that basically told the Hollywood how to make it or what to say in a movie?
Yeah. Um, so it's a sorry, Miracle on 34th Street is part of this cohort before HUAC comes into Hollywood. So we get about 5 films that come out in 46 and 47 um, that are going about business in a more historically American Christmas way, where it is Dickens or Santa, with Santa being the Miracle on 34th Street.
Mhm.
And they're communal films. And then we get this interruption of HUAC and the anti-communist kind of movement coming to Hollywood in 47. And the blacklist isn't lifted. In 1947 also, Ayn Rand is working for an organization in Hollywood called the Motion Picture Association for the Preservation of American Ideals, the MPAPAI, that was formed by the right-wing conservative cohort, ideologically conservative cohort of Hollywood, with people like Gary Cooper and Adolphe Menjou. Walt Disney was in the MPAPAI. And Ayn Rand writes a pamphlet called The Screen Guide for Americans. And in this screen guide, she has 13 things to not do if you want to avoid being labeled as communist. So they're things like, don't glorify the common man, and nobody will think you're a communist. And that's the point where things start to splinter, because we have the blacklist and then we have a list of things that you shouldn't do. And the FBI uh, has a file that they were working on, a report over about 15 years in this period, called The Communist Infiltration of the Motion Picture Industry. It's called ComPIC. You can look it up. It's in FOIA requests online. And in this report, the FBI uses Ayn Rand's points of, they use her screen guide for Americans as a way to evaluate films. And one of those films is It's a Wonderful Life. Another is The Best Years of Our Lives. They fingered both of those films as potentially communist subversion, which is ludicrous kind of notion, because they were very just collectivist films about healing from the national trauma of World War II and the Great Depression and the first half of the 20th century that was so difficult for so many Americans. And beyond that point, after all of this, we have a short break before we get more Christmas films. And from that point on, from 1949's Holiday Affair, our Christmas films are largely vastly different. They're rom-coms, they're simplistic, they're comedies and musicals and farces. Again, still not even anywhere close to religious. They are the kind of basis for Hallmark Christmas films that we have now. This social conservatism ekes into them, and that's distinct in this period, especially from political conservatism. But these films are much more in line with the kind of nuclear family ideal. Insularity, individualism, as opposed to communalism of the Dickensian Santa Claus films that came before.
All right. So when did Ayn Rand's booklet come out?
In 1947, in mid 1947.
So, and that dictated what was one way to dictate what was on the screen. What were the ideals that she wanted to inculcate in her movement, which I understand includes Ronald Reagan? If we can see a line between his early years as an actor and his later years as a politician. But what are the values that they wanted to inculcate with these films that came after the initial films?
So it's largely individualism. Ayn Rand also writes a textbook for Americanism in this period. That's also for the MPAPAI. That is largely politically incoherent, but the idea behind it is that the US is individualism and Russia is communalism, or the Nazis are communalism. We need to be individuals in this country. So it really does follow on that these politically conservative ideas, the ideological conservatism of this period, pressures a social conservatism that we see in the 1950s. Not everyone who was socially conservative in the 1950s was politically, ideologically conservative. I do think that's an important distinction to make. But Ayn Rand's primary philosophy coming out of these pamphlets are You cannot malign wealth. You cannot malign success. You cannot malign American institutions or financial institutions. And you can't glorify the common man.
Okay. So it starts by, what we see today being uh, kind of worshiping the rich, and how we're breaking down some of these things, or some of us are breaking down some of these things that those films were trying to say. So it's how did they justify not including, like, the common American?
So this is an interesting one. So like in It's a Wonderful Life, in the file that they, or in yeah, in the file that they reported on It's a Wonderful Life, and they talk about how um, Potter is maligned and that he's like a Scrooge-like character and everything he does is despicable. And they kind of juxtapose him to George, as we are supposed to in the film. But they said that it's an unfair representation. So they're more concerned with how the common man can make others look bad in their use case of it. And that's kind of absurd, right? Because George Bailey is a very common man, especially in Bedford Falls, where everyone is helping everyone all the time. Um, and he's also the head of a financial institution, just like Potter. So where the FBI uses it to suggest that one financial institution is being maligned, it's really it's not a fair it's not a good faith reading of It's a Wonderful Life at all, or really a use of Ayn Rand's pamphlet, because they're just kind of looking for something to say is potentially communist um, in those films.
So let's talk a little bit about, okay, you're leading up to saying that they wanted to make the impression, the nuclear family, the center, individualism, and at the same when let me start over. So you're getting there through this cultural production and this pamphlet and federal pressure. When and how did that change with the House Committee on American Affairs, which I don't think I just got right, and McCarthy in the Senate?
When did the kind of content in films change?
Yeah, I'm interested in seeing the content as you talked about it changing to getting to blacklists. I want to make that leap, and I'm wondering if you can bridge that gap.
Yeah. So it's really chronological. It happens very sharply that we see a change in Hollywood. And it's not just me observing that. It's not a blanket change for all of Hollywood, but we see an abrupt change in the content of films that in the book I cite a film analyst who deserves so much more respect in history. She's wonderful. She worked for the Office of War Information during World War II as an analyst of propaganda in films. And her name is Dorothy Jones. She's phenomenal. She studied she made a quantitative study of film content before and after HUAC from mid 47 through 1954, and she concluded that there was a huge drop in social problem films very abruptly in 1947 at the end, and then a huge uptick in comedies and farces and this more individualist media. So we see a pretty marked change immediately after the blacklist in just the content of films, things that filmmakers are willing to put on screen, either risking the accusation and risking getting put on the blacklist or the gray list, or not, and kind of folding to that pressure and making films that will not get them flagged for certain content.
Okay, so what would get someone flagged?
So, like any of the things that Ayn Rand said were potential and mostly association. A lot of things were association based, but the FBI also listed Crossfire or The Farmer's Daughter, and Crossfire is a film about anti-Semitism and U.S. veterans. It's a phenomenal film, really fascinating film. 47 or 48 right in this period. The Farmer's Daughter is 47. It's about a farmer's daughter who um, has a journey through education and then becomes a politician. So these two things, anti-Semitism as part of American culture or educated women running for office, were counter to the kind of counter to American institutions that could have been flagged as criticizing the US. Frank Capra has a film in 48 called State of the Union that is very critical and very grim about the corruption of US government. And he has Spencer Tracy as his lead, who is kind of groomed to be a presidential candidate in that film. And he's chosen because he has lots of ideals and is very strong willed to hold up his values. But as he's being groomed to be this candidate, he starts making backdoor deals and ultimately selling out his values for the promise of being president. And it takes Katharine Hepburn as his wife to snap him out of it. And they both give phenomenal speeches at the end of the film that are very aggressively contemporary, we'll say. And that film got a communist review. Lee Mortimer put out a review that Capra was flirting with communism, and it got Capra's security clearance revoked when he was working with the State Department in the early 1950s. So there were really a lot of things. A lot of things could get you an accusation. I mean, somebody having a bad day and feeling vengeful could get you an accusation, and your film or your work could disappear overnight.
And okay, and so can you talk about, so you said that movies move from being, more narrative stories about regular people or educated women running for office to farces and comedies. Were there, and rom-coms. So were there rules and regulations or even just, rules about what could be in a comedy or a rom-com, or even I don't know when the code came out. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that and talk about what was okay in, say, a rom-com?
So the Hays Code is in place from 1934 to 1968 when we get the rating system come in the late 60s. But the Hays Code, and as we get further into this period, the kind of impact of the blacklist and people's willingness to conform to it are both kind of waning, especially in the mid to late 50s. 49, we have Holiday Affair. And then I'll juxtapose it to a film from 1954 that's called Susan's Left Here that needs more context. But so 49, Holiday Affair is about a woman who is a war widow. And she has had a boyfriend for several years. She has a son from her husband she lost in the war. The boyfriend really wants to marry her, but she's still kind of caught up with the memory of her late husband. Then she meets a surprising stranger on like a few days before Christmas, and she has a whirlwind kind of romance trying to choose between the two of them. And in that film, the boyfriend, played by Wendell Corey, and the new beau, played by Robert Mitchum, have this really uncomfortable joke or scene that's played as a joke where they talk about how the weather has changed since the dropping of the atomic bombs. And that
Can I pause you for a second?
Oh.
You used the word uncomfortable. Is that meant as it was the characters were uncomfortable, or that you were uncomfortable watching it?
That's a great distinction. So no, it is played as uncomfortable because they're having small talk. Like they're both aware that they're in love with the same woman and they're having this uncomfortable small talk between them. So they're just remarking on the weather. And they just mention how weather patterns have changed since we dropped the atomic bomb. And that is a huge jump from where we were talking about the bomb in the post-war period with like the best years of our lives. Frederick March's son in that film is studying the atomic bomb in class. And there's a gorgeous scene in that film between father and son where the impact of Americans trying to wrap their head around what we did when we dropped the atomic bombs, like that is in that film. And it's a heavy emotional scene. And then just a few years later, 3 years later, we have this joke about the dropping of atomic bombs. So there is a huge difference in like tone and this idea of kind of making it okay and normal that we dropped the atomic bombs in World War II. So that's kind of this like more pro-American side of the whole HUAC equation. In 54, when the support for this is waning, and the Hays Code, which was this puritanical code in Hollywood, a self-imposed censorship committee with very strict restrictions about violence and sexual content and innuendo even. Support for that is waning. So we get this Christmas rom-com in 1954 called Susan Slept Here with Debbie Reynolds and Dick Powell. And this film is very controversial to talk about now, but it was not in the 50s. Debbie Reynolds she's 22 at the time, but she's playing a 17-year-old who is she's dropped off by a cop at his friend's house so that the cop doesn't have to do paperwork over Christmas. And his friend is ostensibly 35 years old. So they're
it's like dropped off by a cop. She was picked up for
she was picked up
prostitution.
at Christmas Eve.
Okay. Is there hints of like prostitution or something, or just hanging around? And
No, she was just abandoned, and we're supposed to think of her as this like just troubled girl, pure. She's like a pure teenager. So the cop, they make jokes about how he gifted her to this 35-year-old friend of his. And Dick Powell's character, Mark, hears that Susan will be sent to a juvenile detention facility until she's 18. So he takes her to Vegas and marries her, and then refuses to consummate the marriage. But the rest of the film is about Susan trying to convince him to consummate the marriage. And this is a Christmas film from 1954. So that's a far cry from the Hays Code of 34, 20 years ago. And a far cry from even just a few years earlier where we had a war widow. And so much of the conversation in that film is she allowed to move on and have a new kind of chance at happiness after an adequate amount of time mourning her soldier late husband? So we can see a huge kind of social shift in just those 5 or so years.
And so I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the film, but with the man marrying the 17-year-old and her attempting to get him to consummate the marriage, what do you read as the message like, what was the purpose of a story like that?
So I argue in the book that it's a phenomenal source for thinking about gender relations in the 1950s. I think the real idea of that film is that a heteronormative marriage with a wife who is eager to please her husband is the ultimate ideal and will solve any kind of societal problems. A wayward girl just needs to learn how to be a wife, and all will be well is the kind of idea by the end of the film. Susan spends a lot of time in that film. It's called Susan Slept Here. She spends a lot of time in that film watching old home videos of Mark's former fiance and reading women's journals and magazines for how to be a wife and how to be a woman. So there are long sequences of kind of instruction for how 17-year-olds can mature into good wives.
This is really fascinating because one of the things that I've always found really fascinating about the post-war and this shift to the nuclear family is need to get women out of the workforce because so many men were returning, and the overall idea that safety and security was built into everything, even the architecture, the way the films. How does that come out in films, or does it? It seems like it does based on this one, and you're welcome to, widen it out, but how does it come out? Like, what's the trajectory of getting the woman back into the kitchen and out of the workforce, and what was going on in the country at that point through film?
So I'll make that into two answers because there are two important things there. So the first one with women and the workforce. On 34th Street from 47 and Holiday Affair from 49, 2 years apart, both have a woman at the center who works for a department store. So Maureen O'Hara in Miracle on 34th Street is like a boss. Like she is hiring Santa, she's firing Santa, she's doing all of the things in Macy's at 34th Street, like a flagship store in Manhattan. And she's divorced. She is not a widow, which suggests even more agency on her part. She is a single mother. She has full custody. So she is a very agential woman in a job. And by the end of the film, we are not really, there's no suggestion that she will be leaving her job. 2 years later, in Holiday Affair, Janet Leigh is the main character there. She is a corporate shopper. So she goes to other department stores and buys things to spy on quality and prices and how other people are working and all of these things, the shopping experience. And she is bad at her job. And the whole film has a running joke about how bad she is at her job and how she should just quit and marry a new person and get out of the workforce. And those are only 2 years apart. So that is part of that huge kind of social change of like in this post-war period, we were very focused on getting women out of the jobs and into the home. The second part of that question is this idea of domestic containment. So in the late 40s, we had the foreign policy of containment for containing the communist threat abroad. The parallel of that for our domestic but our domestic state of affairs was domestic containment, which breeds this idea of the nuclear family and individualism and controlling what you can. So it's also this age of experts, right, in the late 40s, where we have psychoanalysis as a really prominent, popular kind of treatment for a growing malaise in society. And it's understandable. We're at the start of the Cold War, nuclear threats, totally new existential fears that a large portion of the population are having.
Because it wasn't out of the question that a nuclear bomb would
Yeah,
drop because we had just
at any
dropped a
point.
couple.
Yeah, especially in the 50s after our enemies were developing nuclear technologies. It really could have been any day. So domestic containment is this idea that like everything outside of your home is out of your control. You can't control whether Russia decides to drop a bomb. You can't control missiles. You can't control whether your neighbor is a communist, whether your boss is recording your conversation. All of these fears led to the idea of the nuclear family, that in your home, in the domestic sphere, you could control everything that happened, which obviously is not true. But that's where this idea of the cushion and the safety and the security of a family unit comes from, is just the tremendous pressure and terror and fear of the nuclear age. And that's
So,
evident in these films.
okay. So, how does that, do you think, play into we're having a crisis of masculinity right now? And it seems to me that when you force everybody, um, into the nuclear family, the heteronormative nuclear family, and saying you can't control what's outside, but you can control what's inside. What does that say for, how men were expected to behave toward their wives, how wives were expected to behave towards their husbands, and parenting?
In that period?
Mhm.
Not right now. Yeah, in that period. Okay. So women had much more expectations than anyone else in this period, that women would be supportive of their husbands and their children and do the cooking and cleaning and all of the domestic chores and obligations to keep the household running and support their husband who is working. That real traditional idea. The expectation for parenting was, yeah, much more fell on the mother, but it comes out of this period is really obsessed with, as I said, the age of experts, really obsessed with Dr. Spock, who wrote a book in the late 40s about parenting every child individually. Um, and that was just a very popular parenting resource in this period. So that's primarily what I would say, is that poor parenting, there was even more of this kind of idea of individualism foisted upon children. How that happened in practice is a different thing for sure. And as we see with like Susan Sleptier from 54, the cultural sphere of children is also changing in the 50s because we have a much more recognized social group being the teenager that emerges in this period, where teenagers growing up in this age of affluence as the economy improves throughout the 50s, more kids have access to a car or disposable income. High school is more structured in this period. So kids have more like, or teenagers have more like specific dedicated time to be teens and have their own identity and cash and go to cinemas and like be seen in cinemas and in films of this period. So that's all changing at the time too.
Is that reflected in the films? Either that were in your um, purview or outside of them?
Well, for sure. We get tons of kind of teen centric media in the late 50s and early 60s, especially. And then from then on, teens really become a specific marketing kind of community. Some film historians have said that the most reliable, and people in the industry actually, the most reliable market that you can always count on is the teenager. I don't think that's really true anymore. I think we have different politics around cinemas now, but in this period, it's definitely true that teens were a very common audience and you could write films to them. So in the Christmas films, we get like Susan Slept Here in 54, that is about a teenager being a grown woman, in quotes. In 61, we have the Disney film Babes in Toyland, which stars Tommy Sands and Annette Funicello, who are both huge teen stars from this period. So
Weren't they
they're,
in the Mickey Mouse Club?
yeah,
Well, she was,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Um, and having them as like the central stars in a feature length film was a big deal. So those are the representations in Christmas films for sure in this period.
Were Christmas films any less okay, so were there any, like, racy elements in these teen-focused films? And then a sub-question of that is, would Christmas films in particular, have less of that?
So I would say that both of those teen ones have. So Susan Fletcher is a racier film just by subject matter that she is trying to convince him to sleep with her. Uh, and at the end of that film, she does succeed um, in her endeavor. So that is definitely racier and definitely counter to the Hayes Code. The Hayes Code would not have allowed Susan Fletcher by any stretch in the 30s. In Babes in Toyland, we get this heavy misogyny, like heavy misogyny that even for 61 feels a little extreme. There's a song, there are two songs that Annette Funicello is part of. One is that the villain has ostensibly killed her partner, proposes marriage to her so that they can get tax breaks, is his proposal.
So lovely.
He wants, it's a very fun song called Castle in Spain that, again, very interesting for thinking about this period historically, but whether it like works is a different question. So Annette Funicello sings a song about how she can't do the sum. She can't do the math to figure out her weekly expenses, so she might as well marry this guy. And that's kind of nuts. Like that's like really far in the misogyny. And then later in that film, there's a song that she sings, she and Tommy Sands sing together, that she is just a doll for him to manipulate and play with and pose. And he is like moving her around as a doll on a pedestal. And it's supposed to be a very romantic kind of thing. So it is Disney, so it's not really racy, but I do think that it's a bit further from what we would think of as like a Disney Christmas film now. It's a kind of intense one.
So there's one glaring omission from what we've talked about. Well, there's two.
Mhm.
Um, and that is race. How does or does it even race play a role in this progression of Christmas films? And if there are any, so the first question first, does race play a role?
I'm going to say no, but I'll complicate it. So these films are very white. They're the only Black person that I can even think of in one of these films off the top of my head is Annie from It's a Wonderful Life, who works, she's the housekeeper at the Bailey's house. What we do see, interestingly, in two films from the 50s is some wider commentary about race relations. So it's in 1951, there's a Bob Hope Christmas film called The Lemon Drop Kid that is, I don't like that film. I think it's very bad. And it's very racist in many directions and also ageist and sexist and all the ists. It's very, very kind of ideologically conservative, I would say. In 54, we also get White Christmas, which is a very white film. And there's a song called, it's the minstrel number, called the minstrel number, where they are lamenting the days gone by of minstrel shows. And I point that one out because I find it interesting that White Christmas
I
is
just lost your audio. Guys in the chat, can you hear either of us? Both of us? I can't hear you. Wait, now you're back.
oh, okay. So I'm getting feedback.
Okay. Let me see if putting the earphones back in will help. All
Okay.
right. How's
Is
that?
that good?
We're good.
So White Christmas is a follow on from an earlier Irving Berlin film with, I believe, Bing Crosby, also called Holiday Inn from 42. And that film is about musical numbers at every holiday. This inn is only open for every major American holiday, and they do like a dinner show for each holiday. And in that one, there is a blackface minstrel number in 42. And we can see, obviously, it's not great representation. We're not happy about any of this. But in 54, we can see a progression from the blackface minstrel number in this earlier version of this film to a number lamenting that you can't have a minstrel number now, pretty much is what that like. Oh, we can reminisce about it, but we can't do it now in 54. And I think that shows an interesting progression towards civil rights. We've had a lot of small steps taken between 42 to 54 on the road to more civil rights. Any other representations of race outside of white people we don't really see in these films.
So does that send the message even more subliminally if you equate Christmas with America and only white people are celebrating Christmas in America in these films? Does it mean that people who are not white people may be celebrating in what way we don't know, but aren't quite American?
I get the question. I would push back on it because Hollywood is not the only purveyor of Christmas. Hollywood politics in this period are not as progressive. I mean, Sidney Poitier is only recently on the scene in 1950. We do have a small sect of films and filmmakers working on racial problem films that are looking at the plights of Black Americans, especially 49 through 51, I believe. There are like 4 or 5 from a short period then. And those do continue through the 50s. So that's one area where Hollywood is taking small steps. I wouldn't say that this is the only representation of Christmas, though. Like Nat King Cole is also making the definitive of other representations of Christmas that are more of other races, especially in this period for sure. And on TV, that is also starting to change with like Amos and Andy and things.
Although we're still back in minstrelsy if it's only musician, and I'm not criticizing, I'm just like trying to pull out the threads.
No, I hear you. I mean, it's not a super progressive, like, it's not like, it's a fair question. These films are extremely white. So is a large part of Hollywood in this period, for sure.
So the last group of people that don't seem to be one of many groups of people who are not white nuclear families celebrating Christmas. Was there any even hint at not non-heteronormative people, any hint at like gay people, even if it was, you know, negative?
So in Susan's Left here, there's a character named Virgil who is a career Navy um, sailor. He's in the Navy for a career. Um, and I think you can read his character as slightly coded for queerness in some way. There's a climax issue in the film that Mark thinks that Virgil got the 17-year-old Susan pregnant. And I think that is played for a joke because there is the subtle implication that Virgil may be gay. There's definitely some homophobia and what we would now call transphobia in Bob Hope's Lemon Drop Kid from 51. I think those are the only LGBT, even slightly coded, queer coded characters in these films.
It's really
That's a great
interesting.
question.
So we're getting toward the top of the hour, and I want to thank you for having this conversation. For me, it was, you probably noticed that I asked pretty basic questions. I have not seen many of these films. It wasn't a part of my background at all. So thank you for being patient and explaining them, and also explaining how they changed over time and how what America was, what streams of America thought were involved. I think that was really interesting. I want to give you the chance to sell your book and anything else you want people to pay attention to. So, can you tell us about your book and what else you?
And thank you so much. So yes, my book is Selling Out Santa, Hollywood Christmas Films in the Age of McCarthy. It is anywhere online where you buy books, bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, etc. And yes, I have a website with my husband, Ben, for our public scholarship, where we post our own scholarship. Mine is Review Roulette, as Stephanie said. And Ben has a daily American Studies blog and a weekly Scholar Sunday, where he shares the public scholarship from scores of other people doing work in these public ways. So please do check that out for lots and lots of good public scholarship. And then if you are a scholar yourself and want to get into public scholarship, we have some resources on our website about making the kind of transition between ivory tower and public, breaking down those barriers in various ways. So that is black, white, and red all over. The website is black, white, and red, READ.com.
Thank you for listening to Freedom Over Fascism. You can find us online at www.freedomoverfascism.us. Please become a subscriber, and if you have the means, please support us with a paid subscription.